Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh, it's the Science Cafe with your host, Chris Smith.
Good evening, everybody. Hi, welcome. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Welcome to our Science Cafe, our weekly science event. This is, as far as I can tell, one of the only places in the United States where you can go for a weekly science roundup, where you can figure out, learn about, hear about what's going on in the world of science, how it relates to our lives. Lots of other science cafes happen all over the U.S., but they do them like once a month or once every couple of months. We think we're extra special, and we love science so much more than they do. So we host these events every Thursday night right here in the Daily Planet Cafe, 7 p.m. You can come and hear from people, most of the time local scientists, researchers, and professionals in the realm of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, sometimes in the arts as well, and learn about what's going on, what interests people in the scientific community around us. We can learn about how it relates to us, and I think most importantly, and if this is your first Science Cafe, you'll learn with the format here tonight, we get to learn what you want to know about the topics that we bring here into the cafe. Topics cover just about anything in the world of science. We do brief presentations with local experts, and then we flip the tables and we give the microphones to you. We go around, let you ask your questions of our experts. I think the best way to learn is asking questions, right? What do I want to know about what I think you know, and how can we help each other? And that's what makes the Science Cafe such a cool event, and I'm glad to be a part of it here at the museum. Raise your hand if this is your first Science Cafe. Fantastic, welcome. Thank you for coming out. Give those people a round of applause, because we want you to come back again. This is positive reinforcement. It works. To kick off the evening, though, tonight, I'm going to introduce the director of the Museum of Natural Sciences, Dr. Emlyn Koster, who would like to say a few things.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening. Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, especially those who are here for the first time. Before getting into the context and setting for this evening's talk, I just want to say that those who have been coming for a long time will recognize that the patio is now reopened. Scaffolding has come down, and there is a new safe canopy out there that will deal with any ongoing problems from the nickel sulfide impurities in the glass. You don't need to know more about that tonight, but we're all happy that we can now dine outside. And that was finished just in time for last Saturday's Bug Fest, where some 35,000 people came to the museum in one day. We couldn't really let tonight's Science Cafe start in an ordinary fashion because of the concurrence of such terrible news from the part of the world that is the focus of this evening's talk about the agricultural technology behind coffee growing in Puerto Rico. So we decided this morning that we ought to just recognize the meteorological realities of what's going on in the world just a little bit, and spend a few moments just in empathy about those who are in a terrible situation in Puerto Rico. I was struck in this regard, given that this museum is unusual among nature-focused museums by spending a lot of its time looking at that intersection between nature and humanity. Most natural history museums, are about the past only. This museum is about the past, the present, and the future. And so this kind of issue, hits us square on, and we get into it as much as resources and opportunity provides. So I probably should have brought my glasses from the office to do this, because I've got some tiny print in front of me, but I just want to give you two excerpts from two articles in the media. One, an editorial, an opinion in the New York Times on September the 12th, which was entitled Irma and the Rise of Extreme Rain. And it says, about 40 years ago, the Earth's surface temperatures began to break out of their recent historical range and just kept climbing. Not coincidentally, the number of storms with extreme rainfall began to increase around the same time. Page 2. There's a graph in here which is very compelling, but the article goes on to say extreme rainstorms are up more than a third since the early 80s, according to research by Kenneth Kunkai of the North Carolina Institute of Climate Studies. This is the New York Times. Kinkert's threshold for, quote, an extreme rainstorm varies by region, depending on how much rain a place typically receives. It is a count of storms that would ordinarily occur only once every several years, the sort of storms that stretch a community's capacity to cope. Well, obviously, Puerto Rico's capacity to cope has been walloped by not only the effects of the previous storm, which skimmed the north coast of Cuba of Puerto Rico in this case, and left already regions without power, only to be in the midst. I mean, just look at the size of Puerto Rico relative to the size of this storm. And so, you know, communication is still very difficult. We'll hear from a colleague at the museum who is sort of eager to make contact with family, both in San Juan and outside San Juan. But there's another article here which I think accents the gravity of the situation we face from a nature perspective as we empathize with the human perspective. This is on MSN News on the 21st of September, and allow me just to give you this quote. Hurricane Irma broke already, we know, many records, period. And here's just a catalog of those records being broken. Irma sustained 185-mile-an-hour winds for 37 hours, the longest any cyclone on the globe has maintained that intensity. Irma's maximum sustained wind speed of 185 miles per hour made it the strongest storm that ever existed in the Atlantic outside the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, including those regions. It's the second strongest ever, including Allen, which reached 190 miles per hour. These are sustained winds. Just a few more notes on this extremity. Irma tied an unnamed 1932 Cuba hurricane for the longest lifetime as a Category 5 storm, 3¼ days. Since 1966, when the satellite era began, Irma spent more time as a Category 5 hurricane than any other storm. Irma generated the most accumulated cyclone energy, a measure that takes into account hurricane intensity, size, and duration of any cyclone on record in the tropical Atlantic. It had the second highest cyclone energy of all recorded Atlantic hurricanes, trailing only Ivan. Irma also broke the record set by Hurricane Allen in 1980 for the most accumulated cyclone energy in a 24-hour period. In fact, Irma generated enough cyclone energy on its own to satisfy the NOAA, that's the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration's definition of the average hurricane season. So all of the hurricane season in one hurricane. Since 1986, there have been 18 entire hurricane seasons that didn't generate as much total energy as Irma did on its own. That was in MSN News on the 18th of September. So we are dealing with extreme situations, and we will bring this science to a science cafe as soon as we can get it organized. Some of you may have been here the night that Kerry Emanuel of MIT came with Greg Fischel to talk about the trends in climate change towards increasing intensity but decreasing frequency of severe Atlantic hurricanes. And I think you know that if you plot all the tracks of hurricanes coming across the Atlantic, the intersection of the most of those tracks is right around Cape Hatteras. We are sort of on the middle of all those tracking as they swing across, come northwestwards, and then veer up the coast or veer back into the Atlantic. Anyway, all of that to say that the science of this is extraordinary, and I say that in an alarming context, and that in this case, like the other ones in Texas and in Florida, we're talking about massive human and economic damage. And tonight, our speaker, who will be introduced to you shortly, is talking about a crop which may well be largely devastated for some time to come. It just hit at the growing season, and it's a major lifeblood of the economy of central Puerto Rico. I'd like to introduce and bring to the stage a colleague at the museum, Liani Yerka, who is Puerto Rican and whose grandmother lives in San Juan. I think she reached her last night. but there's other families she has not yet reached, and so I'd ask you to welcome Leanne Yerker, please.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. I just really want to bring the humanity of this, what this means to us in Puerto Rico and to our community. This is a storm like one we haven't seen in probably over a century, if not more. Puerto Rico is much bigger than what you're seeing on the news. A lot of what we're able to get out from Puerto Rico is from San Juan, but keep in mind that this tiny island is a lot of people from all over, and we don't know how they're doing or the extent of the damage because they have no power, they have no cell towers, and this is a country and an island that was already decimated economically. We are struggling through bankruptcy, so recovering is going to be a long and hard road. But there's a lot that you guys here can do. Just supporting us through what we're going through is really great, but if you have it in your ability to donate, money is always going to go a long way, especially because of the economic crisis we're suffering. But support through the Red Cross or any of the organizations on this slide would really help. I know the airport is currently closed or was closed until today, but hopefully they can get the Army Corps of Engineers out there and some engineers to help. But the port and the airport are closed, people can't leave, and they don't have resources right now for them. So all the images you were seeing of Harvey in Houston and of Irma in Tampa and across the Virgin Islands, that's what we're living with right now. And that's the community that we need to kind of think about and support if we can. Puerto Rico really stood up and helped out. We took in all the people from the Virgin Islands who couldn't get anywhere else. So we're refugees are on our island, and now we need the help. So anything you can do would be really appreciated. Thank you for being here and listening. I know Sarah's going to do a phenomenal talk, so I appreciate your help.
Thank you very much. Just one more, maybe unrelated but related thing. On your tables is the rack card for the currently 1 month left exhibition called Race Are We So Different? And I'm going to just link this, hopefully in a way that makes sense. Underneath this atmosphere that is creating all this turmoil and all this damage and all this consternation is a fractious human world. And over on the second floor of the museum on the other building is an incredible learning experience called Race Are We So Different? About the science of race and about the lived experience of race in the United States, and how we are all 99.6% the same DNA. As we moved and migrated and mixed out of Africa 100,000 years ago, we have caused a lot of angst within our own species, which makes the news all the time. So I think it's appropriate, given all of that, not only to ask you to take that pamphlet and think, if you haven't been, to come and see it before it ends on October 22nd, but in empathy with all of the grief and loss of life and injuries that have caused through this last few weeks of nature's wrath in the south and southeastern and Caribbean parts. Could we have a moment of silence, please? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Emily. Who likes coffee? Yeah, that looks like everybody. Almost everybody. I like coffee. I have my cup of coffee right over there. It was warming my insides while I heard about the things going on. And coffee does that wonderful thing where you feel really good when you drink it, right? Raise your hand if you love that morning cup of coffee. Raise your hand if you love that midnight cup of coffee. Looking at my NC State students. Yeah. And also the PhD students and the graduate students who might be here tonight. And those who may be watching at home, I hope you have a nice cup of hot coffee or iced coffee or an espresso or lattes, your Americanos, your cafe au laits, Right? The world of coffee is incredible, and it would be very easy to ignore the fact that coffee is a plant. Even easier to ignore the fact that that plant only grows within a certain part of this world, and that coffee, you can only get it within the tropics. We can't grow coffee, at least not outside, here in North Carolina. So local coffee, you can get it locally produced, locally roasted, but actually, say, growing it, getting it here, it has to come from some other place to here so that you and I can enjoy the delicious pumpkin spice. Okay, thank you for laughing. This is a terrible joke. On our way to work, when we get up in the morning, before we go to bed, if you're like me, decaf. But how do we get something that is the fruit of a plant into a beverage that is consumed by millions daily all around the world? Part of that comes from understanding where coffee comes from and what it takes for these plants to produce a coffee bean and what it takes for the people around that to work. And tonight, our guest is Sarah Prado. She's a PhD candidate at North Carolina State University in applied ecology, and she is working sort of at the intersection, it sounds like, of ecology and economy for coffee in Puerto Rico. Put your hands together. Welcome to the stage, Sarah Prado.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Before I begin getting into the whole biology and ecology of my talk, I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of background about who I am, where I come from, and what got me interested in tropical ecology. So I'm originally from Montreal, Canada, land of the Poutine and the handsome Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. My father is from Peru, which Peru is known for the Amazon jungle and also one of the 7 wonders of the world, Machu Picchu. And my mother is Iranian. Iran is known for many things, among others, the Persian carpets and saffron. So growing up, my father took my brother and I on a couple of trips to Peru to get to know our heritage. And we went to many different locations. We went to the coast, we went to the mountains, but we also went to the jungle, the Amazon jungle, and that's where my passion for tropical ecology really began. In the Amazon, there's an incredible diversity of animals, including this elusive jaguar, the blue and yellow macaws and the scarlet macaws, the piranhas, the red-bellied piranhas, and my all-time favorite, monkeys, like this red howler monkey. So after taking a couple of trips to the Peruvian jungle, I knew that that's what I wanted to continue doing and continue looking at and studying and learning about that ecosystem. So when I started my undergraduate degree, I kind of went in it with that objective in mind. So during my first year at McGill University in Montreal, I took a class on animal behavior. And I got to learn about the amazing behaviors of different monkeys, and it reinforced my passion to study monkeys. But the thing that you don't realize is that when you go in the jungle, it's really dense. And looking high up in the trees for a monkey means that you can't really see them with your bare eyes. You need binoculars. And if you're walking in the jungle, you're often going to be tripping over roots if you're not looking at the ground. So it's really difficult, and I'm an impatient person, so I kind of decided to stop looking for monkeys. And I went for the most obvious thing, which was ants. Ants are all over the place in the Amazon jungle, including these gliding ants, the bullet ant, which is known for having the most painful sting in the world. These ants called Alomeris articulatus, they have a very complicated name, but they basically nest in this plant. And my all-time favorite now, the leafcutter ants. Leafcutter ants are absolutely amazing. They grow fungus in their nests, and that's what they eat. So they harvest these ants to go and cultivate. So basically, they're farmers. So before I left Peru, my last day during my first year, I
really wanted to get a suntan. Being under the canopy of these trees, you don't really get a tan, and I didn't want to leave Peru without having some color to show on my skin. So I decided to take a walk in flip-flop shorts and a tank top with a little sweater in my hands to use as a pillow to lie down in the one open spot that I knew. I didn't take my glasses, and when I don't take my glasses, I can't really see details. And so I just wandered into the jungle, and before I knew it, I started feeling some little pinches on my feet. And like after a couple of seconds, I looked down and I realized I had crossed through this army ant path. And this is the picture on the left is actually the picture that I took while I was getting attacked by them, because I was so amazed by it. So army ants do not have a nest. They nest with their bodies. So they tie their bodies into a ball, and when they when they are ready to hunt, that whole ball starts going down the tree and into the ground. And when you walk into that, you walk across like a few meters of army ants. So I think that was the ants' way of reminding me not to forget about them. And they succeeded because I returned 2 years in a row to go and study ants in the jungle. After I graduated from McGill, I applied to study ants again as a master's degree, but I didn't get it, and instead got to study biological control of aphids at NC State. And that was fun, but it was in greenhouses, and my love for tropical ecology still was strong. And that's when I met Dr. Jaime Collazo, who is now my advisor. And I got to work with him in Puerto Rico, which is now the place where I've been working for the last 5 years, sorry. And this is a picture from Puerto Rico of coffee plantations in the central part of the island. So my project is part of a big project. It's funded 4 other graduate students, actually, 4 other graduate students. And it all began because the Puerto Rico Department of Natural Resources wanted to increase the amount of protected land on the island from the current 8% to 15%. And so here you can see the amount of protected land on the island. It's pretty small, but it's well distributed across the island. But as we heard from Liani, the economy of Puerto Rico is not necessarily doing very well. So in order to obtain this ambitious goal without necessarily having to spend the money, we decided to focus our research in coffee plantations, which have played a very important historical role in conserving biodiversity. During a very intense period of deforestation, it actually was able to provide refuge for a number of frugivorous birds, including these, which were able to survive through that period in the shade coffee plantations. Let me move on to the next slide. So in the 1980s, sun coffee plantation began to be a very important thing that the government was promoting because it could maximize production. But what happened was that by the 1992, the number of sun coffee plantations actually surpassed the number of shade coffee plantations. So in 2000, the Natural Resource Conservation Service realized this was actually happening and was bad for the environment. And so they came in with a different incentive program to offer shade trees for coffee growers who wanted to reforest their coffee plantations to change them from sun to shade. And so in order to do that, they are currently providing 5 species of trees, shade trees, 4 of which are leguminous, which means that they fix nitrogen in the soil, and one of them is a woody species, which can be used for wood later on. And their objective is to reach 30 to 40% shade cover in order to maintain productivity, but at the same time provide refuge for animals. And since the beginning of this program, many of the growers have experienced a lot of benefit, including reduced agrochemical expenses and better working conditions. Working under the hot sun is not pleasant. But really, the documentation behind how this is affecting biodiversity as a whole has not really been investigated. And that's where our lab came in. So one of the students, Kellen Dowdy, actually looked at the effects of shade coffee plantations and sun coffee plantations and forests on this one genus of frogs, which is native to Puerto Rico, also commonly known as the coquí. So her question was basically, how are these species going to respond to shade coffee plantations and sun coffee plantations? And so to do it, she looked at 2 species of frogs, one of which is known as Eleutherodactylus bretoni, and the other one Eleutherodactylus weigmanni. Bretoni is a grassland sun-loving species, and weigmanni loves dense forests. And so her hypothesis would be, as expected, Bretoni would be more prevalent in sun coffee plantations, and weigmanni would be more prevalent in shade coffee or forests. So she looked at these 3 different types of habitats. Here on the left, you see a sun-grown coffee plantation, in the middle, a shade-grown, and on the right, a secondary forest. And so she compared the presence of these coquís across those 3 different habitats. And the way she did it was by using acoustic surveys. There was a frog in one part of the coffee plantation, and she would put out, that frog would sing, and she would put out a recorder on another side, and that recorder would record these sounds. And so here, the sound isn't necessarily working, but imagine hearing the sound of a frog. Oh, no, it didn't work. But do what? Click on the slide. Oh, on the laptop. We don't have access to the laptop. Okay, so it's just going like beep, 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 beep. And then every now and then you'd hear a coquí, and that's one other species. And so basically she got all this type of recording data. Oh, somebody's doing it. Still no sound. That's okay. So all this type of recording data she had to then process and recognize the sounds of one species and recognize the sound of a different species, and that's how she was able to tell that they were present or absent or not present. Maybe they were present but not recorded. And so here's the results of part of her study. As expected, the grassland sun-loving species, Bretoni, was more likely to be found in sun coffee plantations. But interestingly, it was also found in shade coffee plantations at a pretty high likelihood. The weigmanni, which loves highland forests, was obviously very present in forests, but the shade coffee plantation also provided habitat for it. And so here we can see that the shade coffee plantations provide a middle ground for both grassland and highland forest-loving species. The next part of this is about Amaryllis Irisari's studies, where she looked at how shade coffee plantations affected the presence of birds. And she looked at it more in terms of how the transition between the initial planting of the shade trees to the final maturation of the shade trees affected the presence of these birds. So she looked at 2 different groups of birds, one of which was a frugivorous group of birds, which depend on forests. That's where they find most of their fruits. And they also like to live under this type of canopy, a dense canopy. The second group was the insectivores or granivores, which like to live in an open habitat where they can see what they're eating. And basically, she looked at these 3 different categories of age groups of the plantings, from 0 to 6 years, so that you can see her body as for scale. The tree is pretty small. From 6 to 10 years, the tree is getting pretty big, and over 10 years old, the trees are providing the habitat, the canopy. And so here's her results. I guess they'll pop up eventually. If they don't pop up, that's okay. I'll tell you what they are. Basically, she found, according to hypothesis, that the forest-loving species were present all across the sun coffee plantations into the shade coffee plantations, but they were more present in the shade. And she compared these to forest habitats, and they were also in those forest habitats. Then she also looked at the insectivores and granivores who loved sun coffee plantations, and they were present in those sun coffee plantations, but the shade coffee plantations also provided a good middle ground. So, so basically, the birds that love sun and love shade, just like the coquilles, were found in both sun and shade coffee plantations. Shade coffee plantations. And finally, to talk about my research a little bit, I study pollination of coffee. And my question was, how do these shade trees affect the pollination services? So in order to do that, I used hand pollination methods and compared hand-pollinated flowers to open-pollinated flowers. Hand pollination requires the deposition of pollen. So here you can see a coffee flower on the left with the anthers that are full of pollen. Basically, we pick those anthers, put them in a small vial, and using a paintbrush, we dabbed that paintbrush into the vial, got the pollen on it, and painted it onto the stigma, the receptive part of the flower. Then 7 months later, when the fruits were finally being formed, we compared the fruit set, or the production of fruits on the hand-pollinated branches to the production of fruits on the open-pollinated branches. And just a small glimpse of what my results are. On the left, you can see the fruit set. So we didn't find any effect of our pollination method, but we did see in green, you can see the bars for shade, and in yellow, you can see the bars for sun. So you can see very clearly for this coffee species, Coffea arabica, the fruit set was a lot higher in shade than it was in sun. And then the grain weight is also an important measure for coffee quality. When you're buying a coffee bean, you want a big round bean. And so interestingly, here we did find an effect of the pollination method. So when it was hand pollinated, you could see that the grain weights were similar in sun and shade. But when it was open pollinated, meaning it was pollinated by bees, nature, wind, any other animal, you can see that in sun coffee plantations, the grain size was smaller than in shade coffee plantations. And pea berries, which are just a single round bean formed instead of 2 beans in a pod, those were not affected by our type of hand pollination. So in summary, we know that for the coquilles, the shade provides a happy middle ground for the grassland and forest-loving species. For birds, shade favors frugivorous, forest-dwelling species, but the sun-loving species were also found in those sun plantations. Let me go back. And for pollinators, shade favors greater fruit set and higher bean quality. So the bottom line is that shade is good both for biodiversity and also for yield, which is really what the farmer wants to hear. They might be interested in hearing that they have a nice bird diversity, but they're more interested in hearing about what that means in terms of finances. So here we were able to tell them that it's good for biodiversity and also good for their change in pockets. So on that note, I just want to thank Amaryllis, Kellen, and our advisor, Jaime Collazo, for having funded us and sent us to the lovely island of Puerto Rico to do our research. So if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I know I kind of went over everything a little quickly, but that's where you guys fill in.
Thank you very much. Yeah, let's give a round of applause. All right, this is my favorite part, at least. This is when I find out what you want to know. So if you have questions, raise your hand. I'm going to come around with a microphone. Wait till I get to you with a mic, and we'll start. Yeah, every now and then, throw your hands up so that I can make sure that I see where I'm going. So I'm just going to start close to me.
Hi, that was a very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
How about the red cockaded woodpecker? Isn't that the Puerto Rican woodpecker that's endangered that Jaime's been working on for a long time? Does that?
Oh, you mean the Puerto Rican
Oh,
parrot?
the parrot. I got the wrong bird.
No
Okay.
problem.
Right. How do you have any sense of what's happened to it because of the different treatments that you use? Do they live in this part of?
So the Puerto Rican parrot has been seen by some of our coffee growers in their farms, but it's actually kind of a difficult bird for people to see and identify from a distance, so sometimes they might confuse it with another type of bird. I'm not actually a bird person, but one of my friends, actually, Amaryllis, who did the second part of the study, she's here, so maybe she can help answer if she's up for it. Don't want to put her on the spot, but yeah, maybe. Do you have anything else to add? A little bit.
I'll bring you a microphone. How exciting. We got 2 talks for 1.
Hi. The only thing I would add to what Sarah just said is that the Puerto Rican parrot can only be found in 2 populations now, which is in the Yunque rainforest and in Rio Bajo State Forest. So they're not actually moving very far away from those specific areas. We really hope to see some of them in our coffee plantations very soon, but in the past 3 years that at least I've been working there, we haven't been able to see any yet. So some coffee growers say that they see them, but we always think that they confuse them with white-winged parakeets and monk parakeets, so yeah. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
So I hope I get the microphone back later because I have another question, but I thought it would be useful for you to tell us a bit about why, given the advantages of the shaded coffee plantations, why there was so much effort to convert to the sun plantations, and with what consequences besides those that you've outlined?
Okay, that's a great question. So sun coffee plantations allow for a denser seeding of the trees. So just like any monoculture, you can then plant your trees much closer to one another. Also, the full direct sun allows for the trees to get a lot of sun and then produce fruits at a higher rate. So I found that they do produce a lot of fruits, but they're also subjected to a lot of different pests in these warm, stressful conditions. So there's different coffee varieties that have been bred for this type of sun coffee plantations. Overall, the farmers are starting to realize that even though there are sun-tolerant species, they're not necessarily doing the best under the stressful heat of the sun coffee plantations. So basically, the idea was to maximize the number of trees. That was the intention by having a sun coffee plantation, so that you don't have shade trees in the way, and you can get people to just walk across aisles of coffee trees. The consequences beyond affecting the animals is that it has many, many detrimental effects on the environment in terms of runoff. The trees also, because of the shade layer is absent, it doesn't provide the nice microclimate that the coffee trees are used to. The coffee trees also require a lot more fertilizers because there's no natural penetration of leaf litter or leguminous trees that might be fixing the nitrogen. So basically, they're adding a lot of chemicals, and then when it rains, the chemicals wash away into the waterways, which is then affecting the general water system in the island. So those are some of the many effects of, yeah.
Thank you very much for being here. My question was, were you only in the mountainous region for the shade and the sun-grown coffee?
Yes, yeah, so coffee is grown at high elevation. I think the lowest elevation farm that I had was about 300 meters, so about 900 feet. But generally, the bulk of them were at around 700 meters above sea level. The reason being that they need some cooler weather than what is found at the coast, although now they're making some new varieties that, like I said, are heat tolerant, so that they can start actually planting them on lowland coastal grounds. But that's also a different species of coffee called Caffea canefera, also known as Robusta. And so it's more robust and more tolerant to these stressful conditions. But it's also got a more bitter flavor, lower quality. It's not really what you'd buy if you buy whole bean coffee. That's not it. It's what you get in a Folgers blend. So when it's ground up, they'll put some of that because it makes it more bitter, stronger flavor, and it also has more caffeine. So if you like that really strong coffee, then that's probably what you're drinking. And cheaper, yeah. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. One is, with regard to the shade trees, are those native or non-native plants? And if they're non-native, has someone looked at the eventual effect on the ecology? The
Yeah. Oh, sorry. You had a second question?
I do. 30 or more years ago, people where I went to school were studying coffee cultivars. Are there only a few cultivars which would make the coffee bean susceptible to disease? That's my question. I don't know that.
Okay. Okay. So for the first part of your question, which was, remind me.
Are the trees that were planted for
trees.
shade native
Okay.
or non-native?
Yeah, I believe that they're native trees. I think that's part of the NRCS's project, is to reforest using native trees. Definitely that's the benefit to it, and that's another reason why we didn't really know how they were affecting biodiversity, because there's never really been a reseeding of native trees in anywhere, really. Regarding the cultivars of coffee, so there's many cultivars of coffee, and different countries grow different cultivars depending on what they're looking for and the different conditions. Some of the cultivars are in fact more pest tolerant or resistant. So there's like the more common one that used to be found on the island was Típica. That was the name of the variety. But Típica basically got devastated with coffee rust, which is a fungus that comes and basically lands on the leaves, and the leaves get eaten away until they can't photosynthesize anymore, causing them to just lose their leaf and have no more energy. So there's different cultivars for different pests, but there's still some pests that we can't really breed against.
I have two questions. One is, are there any birds or animals that eat coffee beans? And number two, do they raise tea anywhere in Puerto Rico?
Tea, I don't believe they have any of it in Puerto Rico. Birds or animals that eat coffee, I think there's like snails that eat coffee beans. I'm not really sure there's been any documentation of birds eating coffee beans.
That'd be the fastest snail on earth.
It gradually like gnaws away at the fruity or the peel. Basically, the bean is a huge part of the fruit, so there's very little peel around it that actually is edible. I thought I found documentation, took a picture of it, that a bird had eaten a bean, but it wasn't. It was actually a snail. So.
Coffee is grown all over the world, and some are major producers. Do they have the same issue with canopy-grown coffee, and as you're talking about in Puerto Rico?
Can you add like what type of issues?
Places in India, or how do they grow their coffee? Is it out in the sun, or is it in the shade?
I assume they're very similar to Puerto Rico, where they have sun and shade. But now there's like a specialty market that's been developing, because people of our generation, and I'm talking about my generation, are more conscious of the whereabouts of where their coffee is coming from. And there's a very big coffee culture right now. There's tons of coffee shops opening, and you can find which country the coffee beans are coming from, if they're from shade or sun. And generally people are going towards that. There's also certifications for shade-grown coffee, which increase the cost of the coffee and then ultimately help the grower gain more income. So it's basically gearing towards a specialty market of people who are interested in this conservation aspect of coffee. But I'm sure there's definitely areas where they mass produce coffee that is in full sun.
Oh, so based on what you know about the ecology of Puerto Rico and coffee, let's think about Hurricane Maria. Which is better for Puerto Rico coming from Hurricane Maria, sun-grown or shade-grown? That's both for the coffee and the entire ecology of Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I'm just guessing right now. Okay, so the benefits of the shade trees that's been documented is that they provide a buffer. So they provide a buffer to winds, they provide a buffer to very intense rainfall because it filters through their leaves. So I think in general the shade trees would probably be beneficial in such a devastating storm. But the downside is that now is September, and the harvest begins from October and ends around December. And so the bulk of the trees now have their berries all over them. So even though the shade trees probably mitigated some of that windstorm, they probably lost most of their berries, whether they were ripe or unripe, because of the intensity of the rains and the winds. Sun, probably the trees got uprooted and probably got knocked over, branches broken. I mean, the same probably happened in shade, but hopefully at a lesser extent.
So just to follow on to that, can you tell people what happened the last time a Category 5 hurricane swept through Puerto Rico like this in the early 30s?
That's a
What did the coffee industry specifically?
Yeah, so the coffee industry in Puerto Rico in the early 1900s was thriving, and that was a very, very big economic industry for the island. But after that hurricane, it devastated it so much that farmers couldn't recuperate. And so they ultimately stopped farming and moved to a different type of industry. That I think also affected movement from the island to New York, for example, because they couldn't bounce back.
For Puerto Rico, who are their major buyers? Are they the big corporations or the small local roasters and brewers that hook up with different farmers?
It's interesting. Puerto Ricans love coffee. Everyone, even as a child, a small high school student or elementary school student, you drink coffee in the morning. But their consumption is much, much greater than their actual production. So unfortunately, they can't supply the demand that they have on the island, although they do still export some to Europe. Europe is their prime market for their specialty coffee. People on the island do, though, search for this type of locally produced coffee, and they're looking for that 100% Puerto Rican mark on it, because they do import coffee from other countries. Puerto Ricans want to support their own production.
Yeah. So I have a question. So I was thinking about the pollinators that are in Puerto Rico and what their diversity is like on the island. So how many different types of pollinators do you know actually go to coffee plants? Do they prefer the coffee flowers over other plants that might be growing around them? How does that ecological situation work out?
That's an excellent question, and it was actually the first question that I had when I started this project. And because the answer was so boring, I dropped that question.
Thanks.
So there's very few bees on the island of Puerto Rico. People generally think that the tropics are loaded with a huge diversity of animals, but because it's an island, it's not the case. So there's only 36, or when I started anyway, there was only 36 species of bees. During my research, I found new species actually, which was really exciting. So now I think we're up to like 39 or 40. But that's still very little. And in North Carolina, there's over 400 species of bees. So that just gives you an idea. The main pollinator of coffee, after spending hours sampling them, trying to catch them, looking at them on the flowers, are the honeybee. The honeybee is from Europe originally. It's non-native to Puerto Rico, but they brought it in, and coffee farmers are very heavily reliant on their presence for pollination of the coffee. So unfortunately, I think I found 2 native species, a male and a female of the same species on a coffee flower, and so those are the carpenter bees, the local bumblebees, because Puerto Rico doesn't have bumblebees, and 1 tiny species of sweat bee that was on the flower. But I've seen them 3 times, these 3 individuals, and everything else was the honeybee.
I thought it was exciting.
Thanks.
I'm glad I get the mic back. I want to ask you a question that comes from reading that I've done about cacao, so chocolate, where many of the same issues about sun and shade growing pertain. And in the efforts to introduce more shade-grown coffee in places where sun plantations have predominated, there's also been an effort to connect the shade areas to make it more feasible for various kinds of animals to migrate. And I'm wondering if, and this is an ongoing process because, you know, sometimes there's interference with the migration pathways that's hard to reverse. I'm wondering if there's any attention to this kind of thing in Puerto Rico with the movement to further the shade-grown coffee.
I think the intention of people who are actually planting shade is not that far thought. I think that they're thinking directly on their effects of yield. But there are definitely benefits to this. So during that deforestation period that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, that was the habitat where migrant and local birds were basically finding refuge. And so it's really important for the local fauna. So I'm not really sure how else it affected other individuals beyond those birds, but we know that it had a really important effect on them.
So I'm Adam Tarando. I had one of those slides up there. And so we work on this project together as well. But yeah, there is some thought to that in the future. That's some of the stuff Dr. Collazo is working on. Further down the line, I don't know if it's still going on because of all the economic issues with Puerto Rico, but there was some attempts to look at how do we stitch these different parcels together. That could then form corridors through the island. And so they have a larger project called Bosque Modelo, which means like model forest. And so this is a worldwide concept. They've done it, like it started in Canada, I believe, but they took it to Puerto Rico as well. And so that is eventually they would like to get to the point where they're targeting incentives to particular farmers if they can. That would be really important to helping to stitch together a patch, like a corridor and a network of habitat, like both protected forests as well as shade coffee farms that would then overall make a much better habitat overall and improve biodiversity.
There's the physical advantages of having the shade trees. I noticed a lot of them were the Inga species, is that right? Yeah. Is there any symbiotic relationship between those and the coffee plants?
You mean other than
chemically or?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, so the Inga are the leguminous trees, so they fix nitrogen in the soil.
Oh, well, yeah, okay, but nothing.
Beyond that, I don't know. There might be. One of my questions during my research is looking at if there's actually an antagonistic relationship between those trees and the coffee. Because all those shade trees do flower, I'm interested in finding out whether they're actually competing with the coffee flowers to take pollinators away from them, or if it's actually benefiting them as a whole, drawing more pollinators in completely. So it's a good question.
Okay, I'm looking around, see if there are any others. Oh, I see one over there. Okay. On my walk over there, I am curious actually too about public and private partnerships. So I saw one of your slides had the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service logo on it, and so I'm curious about, or I guess the reforestation programs are at least partially managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah.
But what those relationships look like in Puerto Rico.
Sure. U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is part of USDA, they're both partnered together to make this incentive program successful. So NRCS is the one who has all the coffee connections, all the grower connections, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife is the one that's actually growing the trees. And so the two of them together are going to these coffee farms, delivering the flowers, the trees, and then they're helping them seed them and plant them in the correct way. And then afterwards, NRCS or the Natural Resource Conservation Service follows up with the growers to make sure that they're maintaining them in the correct way, because they have to in fact sign a contract, and that contract lasts for 10 years. But beyond that, I'm not really sure.
So that sorry, I'm going to jump in again.
Okay.
So for research like this that really seems to directly benefit the growers, who gets, if you publish or you produce, deliverables, business terms, who gets that information and how does it filter down to the farmers in that case?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually, one of my most favorite parts of my work is to actually tell that information to the grower. I feel bad when people just publish without actually divulging the information to the people who can benefit the most from it. I like to go and actually give presentations to the growers, try to get them all in one room and tell them about it. Many of them were actually shocked to learn that there was more than one species of bee on the island, so that's how little they know about the local pollination. And then also I'm working with NRCS. Once I finish my degree, I'm going to follow up with them to basically publish a pamphlet, something that they can then provide to the growers and tell them this is the benefits that you're experiencing, this is why it's important, and here's some other information about pollinators and how to improve their presence and foster their presence in your farm.
Good talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Since the European honeybee plays such an important role in pollination of coffee, are people studying how it's thriving? Are they seeing any indications of colony collapse disorder like we are in the United States?
Yeah, that's actually the most studied bee. Nobody else wanted to study native bees. Everyone was interested in the honeybee. And as far as I know, last time I checked, colony collapse has not really hit Puerto Rico, thankfully. And I'm not really sure why that is. People are studying to find out why that is, that it hasn't affected them, if there's any differences between the island bees and the ones that are found on the mainland. But I don't know yet what the results of that study are.
For one more round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now you're all the wiser when you wake up tomorrow and start brewing that cup of joe. Now you know. You better think about it a little bit more. At least I hope that you will. And I hope that all the Science Cafes give you something to think about on your way home the next morning and into the next week. Next week at the Science Cafe, we're going to have John Godwin from North Carolina State. He's going to be talking about new gene editing techniques known as CRISPR and the ethics of gene editing. So that promises to be a very thinky sort of Science Cafe. So I hope that you'll all come out, bring all of your fantastic questions. Thank you for coming out tonight, and we'll see you next time. Have a great evening, everybody. Good night.